read 16 books in the second quarter of the year, so let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Fallon. I am 34 years old and I make bookish content right here on YouTube. Today, I'm going to be going over the 16 books that I read in the second quarter of the year, so April, May, and June. And I'm also going to talk about the 5 books that I DNF'd during this time as well. So jumping right in, we're going to start with April. I read 4 books this month, which isn't a lot for me. It's actually on the low side, but this month was all romance. I think it was sort of a palate cleanser month, if I'm being very honest. The first 2 books that I read were the first 2 books in the Avalon Bay series by my favorite romance author, Elle Kennedy. The first book being Good Girl Complex. I gave this book a 5-star. Like everything that Elle Kennedy writes, I absolutely loved it. This book follows Mac, who is a good girl. She's just trying to sort of like do what her parents want her to do, and her boyfriend is a douche, and all she really wants to focus on is her internet company. She has sort of like a blog page situation where people can submit like anonymous things. It's really, really cool. She ends up coming into contact with Avalon Bay's bad boy, Cooper, who is one of a twin. We'll get to that in a second. And just their story just sort of unfolds from there, and it's really well done. And just Avalon Bay in general, the area that Elle Kennedy has created, is such a fun place to be. Like, I really wish that she had more books out in this series, because I finished this series at this point and I just like, I wish I could read more. But then I read the second book, which is Bad Girl Reputation, and I gave this one a 4 stars. The book was enjoyable. I loved it. It just felt a little slow in the middle. It also felt a little bit like the conflict between the 2 main characters was a little bit shallow. So this book follows Genevieve, who is just back in town after being away for a year because her mom died. And she and Evan, who is Cooper's twin, Cooper from the first book, they have had like an on-again, off-again thing since they were very young. But she comes back to town and she's really trying to like change the town's perception of her. She no longer wants to have this like bad girl reputation, and she really thinks that staying away from Evan is the way to do that. But he loves her and he doesn't want her to stay away from him, so he goes on this whole campaign to like change the town's reputation of him as well. So it's a really good book. Their conflict was a little bit shallow at times, but other than that, like I said, I gave it 4 stars. I absolutely loved it. After that, I read Romancing Mr. Bridgerton by Julia Quinn, which I did a whole reading vlog on, so if you want like a more in-depth review of that, I'll link that below, because I do give you my like full thoughts on that specific book. But I rated this book 4 stars. I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I stand by what I said. I like book Penelope better than TV show Penelope, even after the most recent season. But I will say they did better with Penelope this season than they have in the past. I did enjoy her just a little bit more, but book Penelope is definitely way better. But again, I enjoyed this book. It was good. Like I said, if you want more of my opinion on that, go watch the vlog that I did for that book. And then the last book that I read in April is called If You Hate Me by Helena Hunting. And I gave this book a 3 stars, which is like kind of like the standard rating I give a book if I read it and it was okay and I didn't DNF it. But if I'm being very honest, I cannot actually remember anything from this book. I know that it's a hockey romance. It's a like, she falls in love with her brother's best friend and they're roommates and all of that. But other than that, I genuinely cannot remember anything from this book, which I guess says all you need to know. Moving on to May, I read 5 books in May, and a pretty good mix of the genres for this month. The first book that I read was Finley Donovan is Killing It by Ellie Casamano, and I did a reading vlog on this one as well that I will also link below. So if you really want my like in-depth review of this, you can go watch that. But I did give this a 5-star. This was a 5-star read. It was so fun from beginning to end. I really loved it. Finley was a really fun character, as was Vero, and the second book, Finley Donovan Knocks 'Em Dead, is on my TBR. Like, I can't wait to get to it. Really good book. The second book I read was Funny Story by Emily Henry. Now, this was my very first Emily Henry read, and I probably picked her best book to start with, but I absolutely fell in love with Emily Henry because of this book. I loved this book from start to finish. It was just so fun to read. Basically, in this book, we have Daphne, who was just dumped by her fiance for his like lifelong best friend who happens to be a woman. And Daphne has nowhere to go, so she ends up moving in with her ex-fiance's ex-boyfriend, whose name is Miles. And at first they sort of keep each other at like arm's length, like they're cohabitating. They don't really even know each other. They don't know anything about each other. The only thing they have in common is their exes. But over time they do sort of get closer, and then they sort of develop this like fake relationship. I don't quite remember how it comes about, but they end up fake dating, and then that ends up turning into a real thing. But it's just such a good book. Daphne in the book is a librarian, and I've never wanted to be a librarian more in my life than after reading this book. Like, it was just that much fun. Like I said, this was the first Emily Henry book that I read, but I did follow it up with another one right after, and it was so good. Everybody who kept recommending Emily Henry to me was like, start with Funny Story, it's the best one, and they really were not wrong. The next book was People We Meet on Vacation, again by Emily Henry. I gave this book a 4 stars. The only reason I gave it a 4 stars, it was a really good book, but again, I feel like part of the conflict between the two main characters was just a little bit shallow for me. Other than that though, I absolutely love this book. It was very, very unique. You have two best friends. You have Alex and Poppy, who they met each other in college and they had nothing in common, but they ended up becoming friends anyway, and they started going on vacation together every summer, and this became sort of like an annual thing until something happened, and then they stopped. And then in the book, it kind of goes back and forth between the past and the present, and sometimes that can get a little bit like tedious, right? And in her other book that I'll talk about later, it does get a little bit tedious, but with this one it doesn't. It's really helpful getting to see like what they were like in the past versus now, and like what happened and what changed between them. I really, really enjoyed this book. It was such a unique sort of premise that I liked it. It was good. Again, 4 stars. I followed that up with this, which is Don Winslow's City on Fire. This is a crime mystery book. 5-star read. One of my favorite books of the year. Like, not even kidding. Highly recommend. This book is a loose, like, retelling, I guess you could say, of the story of Helen of Troy, which if you don't know, then, like, if you're not a Greek myth nerd like me, you might not know it, but it is done so well. Like, it basically follows 2 warring mob families in Providence, Rhode Island, and we follow our main character Danny, who's sort of like not in the middle of it. He's on one side obviously, but like we follow him as like he experiences and deals with the fallout of what is happening and the fighting between the 2 families. Like I said, it's a loose like adaptation of the story of Helen of Troy, but it's done so well. When I tell you, like, I have notes upon, like, I have like sticky notes throughout this book of when I was like noticing things and like kind of like harping back to like, oh, this character must be this character from the myth, and like, I don't know, so freaking good. So good that I bought the next 2 books in the series. Like, I will be reading this entire series. It is just one of my favorite reads of this year so far, hands down. Like, you gotta read this. If you like Greek myth, like any of that, if you like Greek mythology, you like Greek mythology retellings, any of that, you have to read this book. Even if you're not a big like crime mystery kind of person, I still think that you would enjoy this. It's so good. It really is. And then the last book that I read in May was, well, I didn't read it. I did read it, but I listened to it. It's the audiobook of it's called Sociopath, a Memoir by Patrick Gain. Now, right off the bat, I'll let you know, I rated this 2 stars, and I'm going to tell you why. But to backtrack, just to like tell you how I came about this book, how I found this book, I had listened to the podcast Armchair Expert with the author on it. So it was an episode where the author was being interviewed, and she was talking about how she's a sociopath and all of this, and it was an interesting interview. So I was curious enough that I was like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna look for the book. And it just so happened that the audiobook was on Spotify, and I have premium, so I get audiobooks, you know, whatever. So I was like, okay, I'll listen to this. And I gave this book 2 stars for a handful of reasons. Number 1, as I was listening to it, a lot of it just came across as unbelievable in some ways. Like, there were so many moments that I was like, I don't know about that. Which is never a good thing when you're when you're reading a memoir. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's never a good thing. But After I got done with the book, I did some of my own research, and there's just so much that does not seem to be true in her book that I was like, you know what? I wish I hadn't wasted my time. I genuinely wish that I had researched a little bit more before reading it. But yeah, those are the 5 books that I read in May. Okay, and lastly we have June, which I really surprised myself with June. I read 7 books and the bulk of them were fantasy romance, and that is saying something because I have a complicated relationship with fantasy romance, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And also, if you watched my catching up video, you know that June was not a good month for me. I had a lot of like mental health stuff come up, so, but I am really proud of myself. I read quite a bit in June. The first book that I read was When He Was Wicked by Julia Quinn, which is, I believe it's the 4th, or is it the 5th? I think it's the 5th book in the Bridgerton series. I gave this a 3 stars. I only read this book after watching season 3 and seeing so many people get upset about Francesca's story. So this book, When He Was Wicked, is Francesca's love story. And I saw so many people get upset because her eventual like main love interest is going to be a woman now instead of a man. Now, I don't care about that. I'm all here for it. Even after reading the book, I am totally freaking here for it. 110%. Like, yes, we need this. We need this representation on Bridgerton. I'm here for it. But that's why I read the book, and it was good. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. I stand by Kate and Anthony being my favorite, like hands down. Like, I love Penelope and Colin, but Kate and Anthony are where it's at. Even in the show, they're my favorite. But yeah, it was good. It was nothing to write home about though. Like, it wasn't anything crazy, and I don't understand all the upset. But that's just me. So the second book that I read was The Dixon Rule by Elle Kennedy, which is the second book in her newest series, the Campus Diaries series, which is a follow-up to both the Off-Campus and the Briar U series. These are all her hockey romance books, and I love them. I devour them. As I said before, Elle Kennedy is one of my favorite authors. She's my favorite romance author. And The Dixon Rule is a 5-star read for me. Absolutely amazing. Diana Dixon was such a fun character, as was Shane. He was really, really good too. And I will say, this book kind of like tackled heavier material than I'm used to from her, but it was done so well. It was done just so well, and with like a lot of sensitivity and a lot of like nuance that, I don't know, I loved it. It was so good. I love this series. It was just so much fun, and I cannot wait to get to the next series, the next book in the series as well. Like, I can't wait until it comes out. And then the third book that I read this month was Happy Place by Emily Henry. I will say this was her least recommended. Like, when I first started reading Emily Henry, everyone was like, oh, you gotta read Funny Story or Beach Read or you know, People We Meet on Vacation. But Happy Place was the one that has the lowest rating, and I understand why. I do understand why. So when it came to People We Meet on Vacation, there's a lot of flashbacks to the past, and I think it works for that book. There's a lot of that in this book, and it's off-putting. It's a lot. The conflict between Harriet and Wynne is a little bit shallow because it's just, they needed to communicate. Like, that is the issue in this book. They needed to communicate. Honestly, the side characters, like that found family trope, is what carried this book. It's the whole reason that I ended up rating it 4 stars instead of 3. And just because in general, I think Emily Henry's a good writer, and you know, whatever, but the world she created in this book and the secondary characters and that like family unit that she kind of made out of that group of friends really did carry this book like all the way. I wouldn't say it's a terrible book. Like, I have definitely heard people be like, oh, it's her worst book or anything like that. I haven't read all of her books either, so. But that being said, it's not terrible. It's just, it's a little bit more angsty, and I don't think that the flashback scenes work as well in this as they do in People We Meet on Vacation. So after that, I read, and I'm just gonna talk about these books together because you'll understand why. I read Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and I can't not talk about them together because I read them back to back in a matter of like 2.5 days. Like, I devoured these books, okay? I just have a funny relationship with fantasy romance. Like, I read the Grishaverse, which is the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and then the Six of Crows duology, and then the King of Scars duology by Leigh Bardugo. I read that, I think sometime during COVID, maybe a little bit after. Either way, I fell in love with fantasy romance because of those books. Like, I loved those books. And I have sort of been chasing that high ever since. And listen, I read ACOTAR, I read Crescent City, and they were fine. They were good. I'm neutral on them. I don't hate them. I don't think they're the best things I've ever read, but they didn't give me the same feeling that Shadow and Bone did. But Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, it did. I put off reading Fourth Wing and Iron Flame for a really long time. It felt really overhyped online. And I had been burned before by, you know, reading a book that was very overhyped or that everybody was talking about and it not being all that good. But I had two friends that were like, no, read it, it's great, it's this, it's that. And I finally did, and I am so happy that I did. Violet and Xaden are my two favorite characters right now. I just, like, these books really did reignite my love for fantasy romance. And I absolutely cannot wait until January when Onyx Storm comes out. Like, I will devour that book. Okay, so after I read Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, which by the way, I rated them both 5 stars. Important to note. I was on a little bit of a fantasy romance kick. I was like, I need this in my life. I need more fantasy romance. So I picked up a book called The Ever King by L.J. Andrews, which was a wild ride from start to the end. Basically, it is about fae, but it's two different types of fae. You've got land fae, which are Vikings, and then you've got sea fae, which are pirates. Now, what I will say about this book is that it was a little short for a fantasy or a fantasy romance. I think it's only about 400 pages, and it might have felt short and fast-paced because I just devoured like I had just devoured Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, which are very, very long books. But the story itself sort of, like, I don't know, it seems to go by, it went by really, really fast. Either way though, it was a good book. If you're looking for Norse mythology, you're not getting it in this book. Like, A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle Jensen is steeped in Norse mythology and Viking lore, like a lot, like to the point where if you're reading it, there's a lot of things you can't pronounce. You're not getting that with this book, like, at all. It's just that there's Vikings and there's pirates. I will say the world is really, really interesting and the magic system's really interesting. The overall story though, with the characters, was a little boring. I think that it might pick up later on in the series, but I don't know if I'll read the next book in the series or not. I really just don't know. But it was okay. I gave it a 4 stars. And then the last book that I read in June was Blood and Steel by Helen Schurer, and this book took me by surprise. Like, it had a high rating, but it still kind of, like, surprised me. Our main character, Althea, is really, really interesting from the beginning. She's definitely, like, the chosen one, but it wasn't done in a way that I felt, like, annoyed by, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Basically, in this world, there's a prophecy that kind of, like, ties in later on. This prophecy is the whole reason that women aren't supposed to be wielding weapons, but Althea, like, is a whole different breed. She's like, no, I'm gonna do that. I don't know, it's just a really good book. It's the first in a series. I may continue this series. I think that I probably will. As far as the romance goes, it's kind of a back burner romance. Very, very slow burn, but once it does kind of pick up, it's really good at that point. Wilder makes for a great mentor and then kind of partner, I guess you could say. I don't know, really interesting, really good. Can't wait to dive back in. Now let's talk about the 5 books that I DNF'd. The first 3 that I DNF'd, I've talked about these already in my video, the books I've DNF'd so far this year. So I'm gonna be brief with them, but since they were during this second quarter, I'm gonna talk about them anyway. Okay, so the first 3 books that I DNF'd in April. And the first one is Love Me to Death by Alison Brennan. This is a crime mystery book, and I had such high hopes for this. It just was very convoluted. There was a lot of moving parts, a lot of different names that you needed to remember, a lot of different players. So much happened, yet nothing happened. Like, I didn't know where the plot was going. It was too much. It was just too much going on. It was too complicated, and it felt like the plot was going nowhere, and I just was like, you know what, I can't really even, it wasn't holding my attention, and there was too much that I needed to remember for me to continue reading it, you know? So I DNF'd that. The second book that I DNF'd in April was A Not So Meet Cute by Megan Quinn. The premise of this book was just, it was just too unbelievable. Like, just from the beginning to the end. It was just too unbelievable. And now this might be a little bit of a spoiler, but I learned something. I don't like the fake pregnancy trope. I just don't. I didn't like it. I didn't like how it was done. I didn't really see where it could go either. Like in my head, I need to be able to envision some way that the story might wrap up. Even if I'm wrong, I still need to be able to envision that. And I just couldn't with this book, because it's like, well, if she doesn't fake a miscarriage or whatever, then how is this gonna go? And that would be terrible. I don't know, didn't like it. And then the two people hated each other, and then it turned into insta love, and I was like, all right, I'm good, can't do it, we're good, I'm done. And then this pains me. This really does. You need to understand how much this pains me. I DNF'd Girl Abroad by Elle Kennedy. This pains me because I love Elle Kennedy, but I picked this book up and I hadn't seen it like of hers before picking this up from Barnes & Noble's. But I just happened to see it was Elle Kennedy, and I was like, oh, I love her as a writer. I'm gonna pick it up. Here's the thing, I may come back to this. This could be a soft DNF, but this was very different than all of her other books. It wasn't dual point of view, and it felt a little like we were venturing into love triangle territory, and I just wasn't here for it. So I could be wrong, I really could be. And who knows, maybe I'll pick it up again one day and give it a try. It's pretty thick for a romance. Let's see, how many pages? Yeah, it's over 400 pages, which to me is quite a bit for a romance. But yeah, so it pains me to say that I did have to DNF this. Okay, in May, I only DNF'd one book, and this was originally on my June TBR. I actually talked about it in my video, my June TBR, but I started it, I think, at the tail end of May, and then I just kind of lost interest. But it's Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. I can't pinpoint a reason why I stopped reading this. It's not the characters, it's not the setting. I think I just either got bored or got distracted or something else came up, which happens with me a lot of the time. So this is definitely a soft DNF. I definitely think that I'll come back to this. It feels like a really good summer read as well, and obviously whenever I have the physical copy of the book or I've bought it on my Kindle, I'm always like in the back of my head, like, okay, I gotta at least try to read it. Now if it's Kindle Unlimited, forget it, I'm never gonna go back to it. But because I have the physical copy and I really did want to read it, I think I will eventually try again. But like I said, there was nothing wrong with the book. I think I just lost interest or I got distracted, I don't know. Anyway, moving on to June. I DNF'd only one book in June, and it is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. I gotta talk about this. Okay, so like I said, June was a bit of a rough month for me mental health wise. I don't think this helped. I don't know if I would have been, like, if I would have had a better chance at finishing this book had I read it when I wasn't in a bad place mentally or what, but this book did not help. And like, this is how I got pretty freaking far. This is how far in I got, like, as you can see. If you don't know what this book is about, the main character basically drugs herself to sleep for a whole year. She's very depressed. She lost both of her parents, and the book is so hopeless. It is so hopeless. Like, I love a good sad angsty book, you know, I love that. But I very much started to feel like this was affecting my mental health, and I was already not in a great place. So I honestly don't see me going back to this either. Like, I didn't actually even like the character, which is also fine, but I don't know. It kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I really don't see me going back to it. Even though I have the physical copy, I got mostly through it, so maybe, but it is what it is. I was trying to read this in, like, I had a whole list of like weird girl books that I was gonna do a whole video on, and then June kind of like threw all of my like life plans to the wayside. But so I may come back to it for a video, I may not, I don't know. But those are the books that I DNF'd. All right, so those are the 16 books that I read in the second quarter and the 5 books that I DNF'd. I cannot believe that the year is already halfway done, that like we're already over halfway through summer. Like, it's literally flying by. I don't even know what to make of that. As always though, if you like this video and you want to see more content like this from me, then please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, maybe share this video with a friend of yours that likes bookish content, who knows. But anyway, thank you for watching and I will see you next time.